But it does erode if we allow confusion to replace comprehension. That is why clarity matters. That is why this matters. If we want to understand what just happened, we have to begin with what impeachment actually means. Not what we think it means, not what headlines imply, but what the Constitution says. And how that definition has functioned or failed to function throughout American history. Impeachment, at its core, is a legal charge. It is the constitutional mechanism that allows the legislative branch to formally accuse a sitting president of serious misconduct. Article 2, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution makes this explicit. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for, and conviction of, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. But even that sentence is misunderstood. Impeachment is not removal. It is the first step, the equivalent of an indictment. It signals that sufficient grounds exist to bring the accused to trial. It does not determine guilt. It does not trigger consequences. It initiates a process. That process begins in the House of Representatives. A simple majority vote is all it takes to impeach, to accuse. Once that vote passes, the matter moves to the Senate. There, a trial is held, and only if 2/3 of the Senate votes to convict does removal occur. Without that supermajority, a president remains in office impeached, yes, but still in power. This distinction is not academic. It is the foundation of the entire constitutional process. When we blur impeachment with removal, we erase the architecture of accountability and replace it with wishful thinking. Trump has been impeached. That means he has been charged. But he has not been convicted. And unless the Senate acts, he will not be removed. We have seen this before. Andrew Johnson was impeached in 1868. The Senate acquitted him by a single vote. Bill Clinton was impeached in 1998. The Senate never came close to the 2/3 threshold. Trump himself was impeached twice, first in 2019 for abuse of power related to Ukraine, and again in 2021 for inciting the January 6th insurrection. In both cases, the House approved the charges. In both cases, the Senate declined to convict. So when we talk about impeachment today, we are not speaking about speculation. We are speaking about precedent. We are speaking about a tested and often strained process that has been invoked multiple times in American history, but completed only partially. No president has ever been removed through impeachment. That fact does not mean the process is meaningless. It means the process depends on more than evidence. It depends on will. If we misunderstand that, we will misread every step that follows. Impeachment is a statement. Conviction is a decision. And between them lies the entire question of whether the rule of law still has force when it is applied to the most powerful figure in government. If we want to understand the seriousness of this impeachment, we cannot stop at the vote itself. We have to look at the legal structure underneath it, the resolutions filed, the articles drafted, and the arguments embedded in the official record, because what exists on paper matters. It shapes what becomes possible later, and right now, the record is extensive, detailed, and damning. In this Congress alone, multiple impeachment resolutions have been introduced against Trump. These are not opinion pieces or speculative drafts. They are formal legislative documents, entered into the congressional record and assigned resolution numbers. House Resolution 353 is the most comprehensive. It lays out 7 distinct articles of impeachment. These include charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of trade authority, bribery and corruption, unlawful creation of executive offices, and even the use of presidential powers to undermine constitutional protections, including violations of the First Amendment. One article goes further. It uses a word many of us hesitate to say aloud in political discourse: tyranny. That is not commentary. It is not a headline. It is the actual language of a formal article of impeachment introduced in the United States Congress. It alleges that Trump, through repeated acts of executive overreach, has violated his oath to faithfully execute the laws and to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. This matters for two reasons. First, it shows that impeachment is not being pursued lightly or vaguely. The charges are specific. They are grounded in both statute and constitutional interpretation. They outline conduct, cite precedents, and identify patterns of abuse that go beyond any single scandal or controversy. Second, these documents create a legal and historical trail, even if the Senate refuses to convict. Even if the political will to act falls short, the evidence does not disappear. It lives in the congressional record. It becomes part of the institutional memory of the nation. We have seen this dynamic before. In the Nixon era, it was not only the infamous tapes that sealed his fate. It was the meticulous work of congressional investigators, the compilation of charges, the relentless construction of a case that ultimately shifted political opinion and made resignation inevitable. That didn't happen overnight. It happened because the groundwork was laid in detail through articles, hearings, and resolutions. The same is happening now. Whether or not this impeachment leads to conviction, we are watching Congress do something consequential. Not just react, but document. Not just accuse, but codify. And that work carries weight. It shapes how future lawmakers, courts, and even voters interpret this moment. If we ignore that, we misunderstand what impeachment is truly for. If we want to be honest about where things stand, we have to confront the gap between what the Constitution allows and what elected officials are actually willing to do. Because the machinery of accountability exists, the articles have been filed, the evidence has been documented, the impeachment vote has been cast. But the outcome remains stalled not because the legal path is unclear, but because the political will to walk it is absent. This is the uncomfortable truth. Impeachment does not enforce itself. The Constitution provides the tools, but it does not guarantee their use. It assumes that when a president abuses power, Congress will act. It assumes that loyalty to the Republic will override loyalty to any one man. But that assumption only holds if political incentives support it. Right now, they don't. Trump remains in office not because the evidence against him is weak, but because too many lawmakers still calculate that protecting him is safer than opposing him. In the House, that calculation has already begun to shift. But in the Senate, where conviction and removal must occur, it remains largely unchanged. And that is not a failure of law. It is a failure of politics, a refusal to place constitutional duty above partisan allegiance. We've seen this before. In both of Trump's prior impeachments, the charges were serious. The votes in the House were clear. But the Senate, dominated by members of his own party, refused to convict. They did not argue that the conduct was acceptable. They argued that conviction would divide the country, damage institutions, or destabilize the government, all while enabling a president who had already destabilized every branch of government he touched. The result? Acquittal. Twice. And a lesson absorbed by Trump. That impeachment, like every other rule, could be negotiated or ignored if enough senators were willing to look the other way. This is the pattern we are living in now. Legal authority exists on paper, but without political incentive, it stays on paper. Trump knows this. So do his allies. And until that calculation changes, until defending him becomes more dangerous than defying him, the machinery of accountability will remain inert. We have to stop pretending this is about procedure. It is about power. Who holds it? Who protects it? And who is willing to restrain it? The Constitution has not failed. The law has not failed. What has failed, repeatedly, is the courage to apply them when it matters most. If we think impeachment is only about the present moment, we are missing its most dangerous consequence. Because every time a president is impeached but not removed, a precedent is set not just for what is punishable, but for what is survivable. And when that line is crossed without consequence, it doesn't disappear. It moves. This is the risk we now face. Not just the failure to hold Trump accountable, but the normalization of behavior that was once unthinkable in American politics. The articles of impeachment filed against him are not theoretical. They document real acts of obstruction, corruption, constitutional violations, and authoritarian abuse. Yet despite the gravity of those charges, Trump continues to govern, to campaign, to consolidate influence. That outcome does more than shield him from accountability. It rewrites the boundary of presidential conduct for everyone who comes after. We have seen this erosion before, though not always so blatantly. When Richard Nixon resigned in 1974, it was not because the law forced him out. It was because political pressure became unsustainable. Republican leaders told him the votes were no longer there. The threat of conviction, not the guarantee, was enough to end his presidency. That was a moment when the system bent, but didn't break. It proved that political will, under enough pressure, could still align with constitutional duty. That is not what we are seeing now. Trump has already survived 2 impeachments. In both cases, the evidence was substantial. In both cases, the Senate refused to convict. And now, once again, we are watching as charges are filed. Evidence is laid out. The process begins, and nothing changes. The danger is not just that Trump remains in power. It is that the system is teaching itself that this kind of conduct is tolerable. That impeachment can be weathered. That no matter how egregious the abuse, survival is possible, even probable, if political loyalty holds. And when that lesson is absorbed, it doesn't stay with Trump. It echoes forward. Future presidents will learn from this moment. They will see what Trump did and what Congress allowed. They will understand that the threat of impeachment is real, but the consequence is negotiable. That the line between lawful and unlawful is not defined by the Constitution, but by vote counts. And that understanding will shape behavior not in favor of caution, but escalation. If we let this happen again, if we allow impeachment to be filed, debated, documented, and dismissed, we are not just failing to check power. We are actively lowering the standard for its abuse. That is how norms collapse, not with one dramatic act, but through repeated demonstrations that the rules no longer matter. That is the precedent we risk setting now. If we want to move beyond frustration and toward outcomes, we have to stop asking whether impeachment is justified and start asking what it takes to make it effective. Because the record is already there. The charges are filed. The violations are documented. The problem isn't evidence, it's momentum. And momentum, in American politics, doesn't shift on its own. It shifts under pressure, the right kind, at the right time, from the right sources. History shows us there are 4 conditions that have the power to tip the balance. None of them are abstract. All of them are measurable. And until one of them changes, the likelihood of Trump being removed remains low. Not because he is invulnerable, but because the incentives around him remain intact. The first is a collapse of support from within his own political coalition. As long as Republican lawmakers believe their base still backs Trump, they will protect him. But if polling begins to show erosion, especially among core conservative blocs like suburban voters, older demographics, or major donors, the math changes. What once felt like loyalty begins to look like liability. This is exactly what happened to Nixon. It wasn't the tapes that ended his presidency. It was the moment Republican voters stopped defending him, giving Republican senators permission to walk away. The second is a single, unspinnable event. Something so undeniable, so immediate, that partisan defenses collapse under its weight. This isn't about the accumulation of scandals. It's about one moment that cuts through noise and narrative. For Nixon, it was the release of the smoking gun tape. For Trump, that moment hasn't arrived, or, if it has, it hasn't landed with the same political force. The third is elite coordination. One senator breaking ranks changes nothing. But when a critical mass begins to move, when high-ranking Republicans signal that the cost of protecting Trump has grown too high, movement can cascade quickly. Defection becomes less about courage and more about calculation. And in Washington, calculation is currency. The fourth is electoral change. If Democrats retake the House and make gains in the Senate, impeachment becomes procedurally unavoidable. They would no longer need Republican cooperation to act, even if removal in the Senate remained unlikely. The political dynamics would shift, forcing Republicans to go on record, shaping the environment for future elections, and raising the cost of continued inaction. None of these four conditions are guaranteed, but all of them are possible. And they remind us that change does not come from outrage alone. It comes from leverage, from real, structural shifts that alter how power is protected or exposed. If we want this impeachment to matter, we cannot simply wait. We have to understand where pressure works and apply it relentlessly. If we believe impeachment only matters when it ends in removal, then we are misunderstanding its deeper purpose and overlooking its long-term power. Because impeachment is not just about the present occupant of the presidency. It is about the institutional memory of democracy. It is about whether future generations will be able to look back and say, without ambiguity, that this behavior was not ignored, that it was challenged, documented, and placed on record. That alone changes the stakes. When Congress drafts and votes on articles of impeachment, it does more than accuse a sitting president. It creates a permanent legal and political marker, a line that says, this conduct crossed it. Even if conviction doesn't follow, the act of impeachment sends a signal downstream, to courts, to agencies, to future Congresses, to the public. It defines what was contested and what was normalized, and that difference will shape how future power is exercised and constrained. We often think of accountability as a moment, a dramatic shift, a fall from power. But most accountability is cumulative. It builds through repeated assertions that something is wrong, that norms have been broken, that lines have been crossed. Those assertions matter, even when they don't immediately lead to removal, because they become part of the framework that future institutions draw upon when deciding whether to act. That is what is happening now. Trump has not been removed, but he has been impeached. Again. And that fact cannot be undone. It is written into the congressional record. It is cited in legal filings. It will appear in textbooks and law reviews and judicial opinions for decades to come. It is a line of resistance not just political, but constitutional against the idea that a president can operate with impunity. If we ignore that, we allow silence to become complicity. If we erase impeachment because it didn't result in removal, we invite future presidents to believe they can do the same or worse and survive. And each time that lesson is reinforced, the gap between power and accountability widens. Eventually, that gap becomes a void. And in that void, democracies decay. This is why impeachment matters, even when it fails. It reminds us and those who govern after us that there is a record. That misconduct was named, that institutions did not stay silent, and that, sometimes, memory is its own form of restraint. What we choose to document becomes what we are willing to defend. And if we stop documenting altogether, if we treat impeachment as empty, unless it ends in victory, we surrender one of the few tools democracy has left to name abuse before it becomes accepted as the new normal. We began this moment with a vote. A single action in the House of Representatives that added a permanent chapter to the history of the American presidency. Trump has been impeached again. That fact is not symbolic. It is legal, it is procedural, and it is irreversible. But as we've seen, it is not the end. It is not even a verdict. It is the beginning of a question. Will the system that charged him find the will to hold him accountable? That is where we now stand between documentation and enforcement, between precedent and consequence. The Constitution has been followed. The articles have been approved. The machinery is in motion, but machinery doesn't operate itself. It requires people, elected officials, to act not just when it's easy, but when it's costly. And right now, too many of them still believe that protecting Trump is less costly than confronting him. That's not a constitutional failure, it's a moral one. We should be clear-eyed about what this means. Trump remains in power not because he is innocent, but because those in power fear his base more than they fear the erosion of democratic norms. That calculation is political, but its consequences are constitutional. Because every time we document abuse without enforcing consequences, we change what future leaders believe they can get away with. That's why this moment matters. Not because it delivers closure, but because it refuses silence. Because it affirms that some actions are intolerable, even when institutions flinch. Because it leaves a mark in the record, in the law, in the collective understanding of what the presidency is supposed to be. And this is where we stand not as observers, but as citizens. We believe that truth matters, that institutions must be pressured to function, that silence is not neutral. We do not say this to be dramatic, but because we understand how democracies fail not suddenly, but slowly. Through accumulated tolerance for what once would have been disqualifying. Impeachment alone is not accountability. It is a tool, and like any tool, its power depends on how and when it is used. Our opinion is simple. This impeachment was warranted. The record is overwhelming. And if we refuse to enforce the standards we still claim to believe in, we cannot be shocked when those standards collapse. Disclaimer. This commentary represents an informed political analysis based on publicly available information, historical precedent, and constitutional interpretation. It does not offer legal conclusions, nor does it predict future judicial or congressional actions. Our goal is to provide context, clarity, and civic understanding, not to serve as a substitute for official legal proceedings or media reporting. Trump has been impeached. He has not been removed. The story is still unfolding, and history is still watching.